So in this video, we are going to be talking about three very important properties that come with Flexbox, which are flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. Now, although it might not seem like it, these actually are completely responsible for the responsive power of Flexbox, and it's what really makes it what it is today and why it's used so commonly over things like floats and display types. So first of all, if we look at it now, it might seem that flex grow and shrink just specify the width and height. And although they sort of do, they are very different when it comes to the core concept and how it's decided. So the first thing we need to do is talk about the flex basis property, because from there we're going to define everything else. Now, we all know that we have 5 items here and they take up a certain amount of space each. But you can see that there's all of this extra room here on the side. So what actually happens is these properties work to define how the extra space or this remaining excess space is divided up between them. And from there, we can actually specify the widths based on the, browser width. And it's all responsive, so it's all decided completely based on the browser and on the properties that you define. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and actually add this property to all of them, and I'm going to explain why in just a second and why we need to do that. So what I'm going to do is first of all, I'm going to go ahead and add the flex grow property, then the flex shrink property. Now we're not going to use all of these in one go, we're just going to do this gradually. And then our flex basis. Okay, so let's talk about flex basis first. What this does is it pretty much defines the minimum width of an item or a flex item. So this can be any value. It doesn't have to be a specific number or unit. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and set this as maybe 100 pixels for each one as its minimum width. We go ahead and refresh the page, and now you can see it's a lot wider, but you can see that there's still this extra space. So this is where our flex grow property comes in. Now what happens is if I actually go ahead and go to all of them and set them all as 1, what this is pretty much going to say is every flex item is going to get the same amount of extra space. So you can see that this gets, if all of them are 1, they all get the same amount. Let's go ahead and see that when we refresh the page. You can see now there's only a little bit of margin, which is normal, but all of them are divided up equally now that we've set them as 1. But what happens if we go ahead and actually change this value? Let's go ahead and, for example, set our 5th item as 2 maybe. So now you can see that although it's not much bigger, it is a little bit bigger. So what this is let me go ahead and set it to actually something a little bit bigger so it's more obvious. So you can see now this is a lot bigger than the other items. So pretty much what this is saying is our 5th item, this container item, is going to get 5 times as much excess space as the rest of the items here. So one thing you need to know about flex grow is that you need to add this property to every single one of them and make sure that they have a defined value. If you want them just to give them a default space, give them a value of 1. And this is because what happens is when you don't give them any value, if you give this flex grow property to anything, it's going to eat up all that extra space. Let's go ahead and demonstrate this now. I'm going to go ahead and erase all of these flex grow properties just temporarily, and then I'm going to leave it on this one. Now I'm going to set it to 1. Now you might expect this is to be just a little bit bigger, but let's see what actually happens. If we go ahead and refresh the page, you can see that this is actually bigger than when we set this to this flex grow property to 5. So what's going on here? Pretty much what's happening is the default value for our flex grow property is actually 0, which means it's going to remain at the same width and it's not going to take up any excess space. So pretty much what's happening is when we set this to 1, everything else is not taking any excess space, leaving it all to that 1 value. So all of that extra space is taken up by this block here. And you can see that, and it's proven because there is still no excess space here since it's all taken up by this property. So what I would recommend is before we learn the flex property in the next video, just go ahead and add this flex grow property to every single item or container if you plan to use it. So now if we go ahead and refresh the page, you can see that that's working great. Now what's the advantage of using this? Before we move on to our next property, if I actually resize this window right here, I'm just going to resize it, you can see that when it grows, it still takes up the same proportions of excess space. Now we'll talk about getting smaller in just a little bit, but you can see here that it does actually take up the same proportion, and that's where the really responsive power of Flexbox comes in. Is when you're resizing your windows and browsers and there's all of the different devices, this actually stays the same. So let's move on to our next property now, flex shrink. So we know that the basis or the minimum width is 100 pixels. That's the minimum it can go. But when we actually shrink this down and all of these get smaller, I'm actually going to go ahead and remove the flex wrap property from here because it's a little bit intrusive here. And although it's not good for this example, we'll go ahead and use it later. So when we go ahead and actually shrink this window, you can see that that proportion is actually lost. So what's going on here? Pretty much when you go below the minimum width, whether it's defined on our flex basis or the minimum width of the container item itself, what's happening is that proportion is completely removed and you go to the default value of flex shrink. So flex shrink is similar to flex grow, except what happens is it defines the rate of shrinkage of each container item, again, relative to the rest of the items. So in this case, what we have to do is go ahead and look at how this shrink property works. The default value for this, unlike flex grow, is 1, not 0. So what this is saying is shrink each item at the same rate as all the other items. And that's why we can see that once we go under the minimum width, you can see that all of those items begin to look the same. So what I'm going to do here is actually go ahead and show you how to manipulate this. And this is where the real responsive power comes in and where you can really change how everything looks on different devices. All we have to do is go ahead and specify the value that we want here. And one thing to note is that if you don't want something to shrink, you can just set the value to 0. So for example, if I wanted to remove the shrinkage of our fourth item here, or let me go with our first item right here, all I have to do is go ahead and set our shrink value to 0. And what this is going to say is don't shrink the item. Even if it goes below, do not shrink the item at all, let everything else shrink. Let's go ahead and see how this looks on our site. So we're going ahead, we're removing that space, but you can see that our first value does not shrink at all. So there we go. Now let's go ahead and start adding our shrinkage values to the rest of our items here. So what I'm going to do is first add a value of 1 to all of them, just like this, just to keep everything the same. And now what we're going to do is go ahead and start manipulating them. So first of all, let's go ahead and say that we want our middle value to shrink 3 times as fast. So we're going to go over to our middle value and change the flex shrink to 3 times. So now we go ahead and refresh the page, and when we shrink it, you can see that that value shrinks 3 times as fast as everything else. So you can see that, and it's pretty apparent there. So there we go. That's pretty much it for our 3 values. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is if your flex shrink is 1 and it's not there on purpose, you can actually go ahead and remove it since the default value is 1. I forgot to mention that in the when I started changing them. But there we go. Now what I'm going to say is, why would you use something like this, flex grow and flex shrink? When you're laying out entire pages based on Flexbox, you want to make it as responsive as possible. You don't want to go and, have it look completely different on one device to the other. What you can actually do is use this to change the look of a website depending on what device you're on. So for example, you can use this property to change the look of a website on a mobile phone versus on a widescreen TV. It's going to be completely different, and you can do this using only a few properties instead of having to go and define entire styles for separate devices. So from here, we can actually really see the true power of Flexbox. From here, we can go ahead and actually model our website with just a few styles that are very streamlined and efficient to change the look of a website completely on different devices. So I hope that was a little bit easy to understand. Now I know it's quite hard to wrap your head around, but this is the core concept of Flexbox, and it's what really makes Flexbox what it is. So if you understand this, the rest of Flexbox and using it is going to be a breeze. All right, let's move on.